took her from her home, and sold her to a kingdom that did not know her name. He was born to rule, trained to obey, and forbidden to choose. In Scylla, love was not a right. It was a crime. One glance became a secret. One secret became a threat. If he followed his heart, she would die. If he obeyed the throne, he would lose his soul. Some loves are not meant to survive, unless they change the world. When kingdoms forbid love, only the brave dare to rule differently. The ships arrived at the port of Quan on a morning when the sea mist hung so thick that the dock workers could hear the vessels before they saw them, the creak of ancient wood, the splash of oars cutting through gray water, the shouts of merchants in languages that twisted and curled like smoke. Among the cargo unloaded that day were bolts of silk from the Tang territories, jars of fragrant oils, weapons forged in distant furnaces, and something else. Something that would alter the course of a kingdom. She was 17 years old, though she had lost count of the seasons since she had been taken. Her name was Adia, which meant gift in the language of her mother's people, but no one had spoken that name in so long that she sometimes wondered if she had dreamed it into existence. The slavers who had dragged her across deserts and mountains and finally onto ships that smelled of rot and fear had called her nothing at all, or else things that were not names but curses, commands, degradations. She had learned to answer to silence. The journey had been a descent through circles of suffering she had not known existed. From the green hills of her homeland where she had helped her mother tend goats and learned to identify healing plants by their leaves, she had been thrust into a nightmare of chains and darkness. First came the raid, men on horses with blades that caught the sun, her village burning, her mother's scream cut short, her younger brother's hand torn from hers in the chaos. Then the march, feet bloodied on stones, the taste of dust and despair. Then the holding pens, where human beings were sorted like grain. Then the ships, where she learned that the body could continue breathing even when the soul wished to stop. Now she stood on unfamiliar ground, in a land where the people had skin like polished amber and eyes that held shapes she could not read. The language fell on her ears like rain on leaves. She could hear it but not hold it. Around her neck was a bronze collar, and around her wrists were marks from ropes that had only recently been removed. She swayed slightly, her legs uncertain after so long at sea, and a hand shoved her forward into a line with others who had made the same terrible journey. The slave merchants spoke in rapid voices to men who appeared to be buyers, gesturing at the merchandise with the same casual assessment one might give to livestock. Adia kept her eyes downcast, a survival tactic she had learned early. To look directly at these men was to invite attention, and attention meant pain. But through her lowered lashes, she observed everything. The strange architecture of the buildings with their curved roofs. The clothing of the local people, flowing and layered in ways so different from her own lost garments. The smell of unfamiliar foods cooking somewhere beyond the market square. A man approached their line, and Adia sensed immediately that he was different from the others. His robes were finer, his bearing more assured. He moved slowly down the row, examining faces, checking teeth and hands as if selecting fruit. When he reached her, he paused. She felt his gaze like a weight. "This one," he said to the merchant in a language Adia did not understand. "She has intelligence in her eyes. The queen consort has requested household slaves who might be trained for finer service." The merchant named a price. The fine-robed man countered. They haggled while Adia stood frozen, understanding that her fate was being decided in words she could not comprehend. Finally, coins changed hands, and the man gestured for her to follow him. She walked behind him through streets that seemed to belong to another world entirely, past buildings that spoke of power and permanence, toward the massive gates of what could only be a palace. The royal palace of Silla rose from the earth like a mountain shaped by divine hands. Its walls were thick and high, painted in colors that seemed to absorb the sunlight, deep reds, brilliant golds, blacks that held depth like night water. Guardian statues flanked every entrance, their stone faces fierce and eternal. Inside those walls lived the Wang, King Jigeum, the 20th ruler of Silla, and his family. Inside those walls lived a hierarchy as rigid and unquestionable as the movements of the stars. Adia was taken to the servants' quarters, a maze of small rooms and narrow corridors that existed beneath and behind the splendor of the main palace. Here she was stripped, washed with cold water and harsh soap, her hair examined for lice, her body checked for disease. The women who performed these tasks were not cruel, but neither were they kind. They were efficient. She was given simple clothing, a rough hemp tunic and trousers, sturdy shoes, and a cloth to tie back her hair. The bronze color remained. An older woman with a face carved by decades of service took responsibility for her. The woman's name was Oksha, and though they shared no common language, she communicated through gestures and repetition. She showed Adia where to sleep, a mat in a room with a dozen other slave girls, all of whom had come from different corners of the known world. She showed her where to eat, a courtyard where servants gathered twice a day for simple meals of rice, soup, and vegetables. She showed her what to do, cleaning, carrying, serving, always with eyes down and movements silent. The palace was a world unto itself, containing multitudes within its walls. There were gardens designed for meditation, their paths winding between carefully placed stones and pruned trees. There were courtyards for ceremonies, their grounds swept clean each dawn. There were halls for governance, where nobles gathered to advise the Wang on matters of state. There were private chambers for the royal family, forbidden to all but the most trusted attendants. And there were the spaces between corridors and storerooms and forgotten corners where those who served moved like ghosts, seen but not acknowledged. Adia learned quickly because her survival depended on it. She learned to recognize the stern face of the head steward who could order a beating for the smallest infraction. She learned to identify the different ranks of servants by the colors they wore and the tasks they performed. She learned which courtiers were kind enough to ignore a slave's presence and which ones would strike out with casual cruelty. She learned the rhythms of the palace, the morning bell that woke the household, the evening drums that marked the closing of the gates, the night watches when guards paced the walls. But in all those early days of learning, she did not see him. The crown prince. The heir to the throne. The man who would change everything. Prince Kwan was 23 years old and had spent every one of those years being shaped into a weapon of state. From the moment of his birth, announced by drums and celebrated throughout the kingdom, his life had belonged not to himself but to Silla. His childhood had been a curriculum of duty. While other boys played, he studied statecraft. While they ran free, he practiced calligraphy until his hands cramped, memorized the classics until his eyes burned, trained in martial arts until his body moved with lethal grace. His father, King Jaigiam, was a man of iron will and unshakable conviction. He had ascended to the throne during a time of external threats and internal fractures, and through sheer force of personality and strategic brilliance, he had stabilized the kingdom. But that stability had come at a cost, a rigidity of thought, a resistance to change, an absolute belief that tradition was the only wall strong enough to hold back chaos. "You are not merely a man," his father had told him countless times since childhood. "You are the future of Silla. Your blood carries the weight of centuries. Your choices will echo through generations. There is no room for weakness, no space for sentiment, no tolerance for deviation from the path our ancestors laid before us." Quan had internalized these lessons so deeply that they had become the architecture of his soul. He was disciplined, strategic, and controlled. He spoke little and listened much. He could debate philosophy with the kingdom's scholars, discuss military tactics with the generals, and navigate the treacherous politics of the noble houses with a diplomat's skill. He was everything a crown prince should be. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when he felt the weight of his own existence like chains. Moments when he looked out from his chambers toward the mountains beyond the palace walls and wondered what it might be like to simply walk toward them without purpose or plan. Moments when he heard laughter from the streets beyond the palace and felt a strange hollowness in his chest. Moments when he caught himself wondering if there was more to life than duty. These moments never lasted long. He would shake himself from such thoughts, recognizing them as dangerous indulgences. He had been promised in marriage to Lady Xiaoyun, the daughter of the most powerful noble family in the kingdom. It was a political alliance that would strengthen his father's hold on the throne and ensure stability during the transition of power. Lady Seoyeon was beautiful, educated, and appropriate. The wedding would take place after the next harvest, and he would produce heirs, and the cycle would continue. This was the way of things. He did not expect love. Love was for peasants and poets. For a prince, there was only duty. It was during the festival of the autumn moon that Quan first saw her, though he did not know then what that glimpse would cost him. The festival was one of the most important celebrations in the Scylla calendar, a time when the palace opened its gates slightly to allow the nobles and high-ranking officials to attend ceremonies in the royal gardens. Lanterns were hung throughout the grounds, casting a warm glow that transformed the familiar paths into something magical. Musicians played traditional instruments, their melodies drifting through the evening air. Dancers performed, their movements telling stories of gods and heroes. Tables were laden with delicacies, and wine flowed freely. Quan participated because he must, moving through the crowd with the grace expected of him, exchanging pleasantries with nobles whose names and allegiances he had long ago memorized. Lady Seoyeon was at his side, radiant in silk embroidered with chrysanthemums, her smile perfect and rehearsed. She spoke when appropriate, laughed at the right moments, and embodied everything that was expected of a future queen. He felt nothing when he looked at her except a vague sense of aesthetic appreciation, as one might admire a well-crafted vase. It was late in the evening when he stepped away from the main gathering, seeking a moment of solitude. He walked toward one of the smaller gardens, where the lantern light was dimmer and the sounds of celebration faded to a distant murmur. The moon hung full and bright in the sky, its light silver on the carefully raked gravel paths. That was when he saw her. She was kneeling beside a stone basin, washing tea bowls that would be used for the next round of service. Her movements were efficient, but somehow also graceful, her dark hands moving through the water with a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. She wore the simple clothing of a slave, and her hair was tied back with a plain cloth. But in the moonlight, something about her presence arrested him completely. Perhaps it was the way she paused for just a moment, looking up at the moon with an expression of such profound longing that it seemed to contain entire worlds. Perhaps it was the way the light caught her profile, revealing features so different from anyone he had ever seen, the rich darkness of her skin, the full curve of her mouth, the elegant line of her neck. Perhaps it was simply that in that moment, she seemed more real than anyone he had encountered all evening, more present, more alive. She sensed his presence and immediately lowered her gaze, her body going still with the particular tension of someone who knows they might be in danger. She did not look at him again, did not acknowledge his existence except through that sudden stillness. He should have walked away. He should have continued his path through the garden and forgotten he had seen her. Instead, he found himself speaking. "What is your name?" The words were out before he could reconsider them. She did not respond, and he realized she might not understand his language. He repeated the question more slowly, though he knew it was futile. Still kneeling, still with her eyes downcast, she remained silent. But he saw her hands tremble slightly in the water, sending small ripples across the surface. "Do you understand me?" he asked, softer now, though he could not have explained why he was pursuing this. Finally, she shook her head, a tiny movement, barely perceptible. No, she did not understand. For a long moment, they remained frozen in their respective positions, he standing on the path, she kneeling by the basin, the moonlight falling on both of them like a blessing or a curse. He felt something shift inside his chest, some small crack in the armor he had built around himself over 23 years. It frightened him. It fascinated him. Then he heard footsteps approaching, other guests seeking the quiet of the garden, and the spell broke. He turned and walked away quickly, rejoining the celebration as if nothing had happened. But for the rest of that night, and for many nights after, he found himself thinking of that moment. Of dark hands in moonlit water. Of a face turned toward the sky with undisguised longing. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself he would forget. He was wrong on both counts. In the weeks that followed the festival, Adia began to learn fragments of the language. Okja was patient, repeating words until Adia could mimic the sounds, pointing at objects and speaking their names, correcting pronunciation with gentle taps. The other slave girls helped too, each adding vocabulary from their own broken understanding. It was slow, painstaking work, but Adia had always been quick to learn, and necessity sharpened her mind. She learned the words for the tasks she performed. Clean, carry, fetch, bow, silent, quick. She learned the words for the places within the palace. Garden, hall, kitchen, chamber, gate. She learned the words for the hierarchy that governed this world. King, queen, prince, noble, servant, slave. Each word was a key that unlocked a small portion of the prison she inhabited, allowing her to navigate with slightly more awareness, slightly less terror. But she also learned the words that no one taught her directly, the ones she picked up from whispered conversations between other servants, from fragments of dialogue overheard when she stood invisible in corners during noble gatherings. Forbidden, punishment, death, exile. These words seemed to carry special weight, spoken with particular care, as if naming them too loudly might summon their reality. She learned, too, about the prince. Everyone spoke of him with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was the future of Scylla, the only son of the Wang, the heir upon whom all hopes rested. He was brilliant, disciplined, and untouchable. His marriage to Lady Xiaoyun was spoken of as inevitable, a union that would secure the kingdom's stability. To even look at him directly was considered presumptuous for someone of Adia's station. To speak to him without being addressed first would be unthinkable. So when she sometimes caught glimpses of him moving through the palace corridors surrounded by attendants and advisors, she made sure to press herself against walls, to make herself as small and invisible as possible. She did not think of the night in the garden. Or rather, she tried not to think of it. But sometimes, in the moments before sleep claimed her on her thin mat in the crowded servants' room, the memory would surface unbidden, his voice in the darkness, the strange gentleness of his question. The way the moonlight had carved his features into something almost godlike. She scolded herself for such thoughts. They were dangerous. They were foolish. They were the kind of dreaming that could get a slave girl killed. Quan, meanwhile, was discovering that forgetting was more difficult than he had anticipated. In his disciplined mind, he had allocated the incident a small space, categorized it as an anomaly, and instructed himself to move forward. But the human heart does not always obey such instructions. He found himself, during long strategy meetings with his father's advisors, thinking of that moment in the garden. He found himself, while practicing sword forms in the training yard, remembering the grace of her hands moving through water. He found himself, during formal dinners with Lady Xiaoyun and her family, wondering what language the slave girl spoke in her homeland, what stories she carried inside her. He told himself he was merely curious about the slave trade routes that brought foreign captives to Silla. It was, after all, a legitimate matter of state interest. The kingdom's prosperity depended partly on trade with distant lands, and understanding those networks was the duty of a future king. So he began asking questions of the royal treasurer, of the merchants who had contracts with the palace, of anyone who might provide information without revealing the true nature of his interest. What he learned disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. The slaves came from everywhere, from the northern tribes beyond the mountains, from kingdoms to the south and west, from lands so distant that the journey took months or years. They were captured in raids, purchased from desperate families, seized as prisoners of war. They were transported in conditions that resembled death more than life. Many died on the journey. Those who survived were sold like rice or cloth, their value determined by age, strength, beauty, and malleability. It was legal, accepted, and considered no more remarkable than any other form of commerce. Quan had grown up surrounded by slaves and had never questioned their presence. They were simply part of the order of things, as natural as the stones in the palace walls. But now, for reasons he could not fully articulate, the system began to feel like a weight in his chest. He tried to distract himself with his duties. He spent long hours studying military strategies with the generals, preparing for potential conflicts with neighboring kingdoms. He attended ceremonies and rituals, performing his role with the precision expected of him. He met with Lady Seoyeon's family to discuss wedding arrangements, nodding at appropriate moments while his mind was elsewhere. He trained harder in the martial arts, pushing his body to the point of exhaustion in hopes that physical fatigue would silence his thoughts. Nothing worked. It was during a formal inspection of the palace grounds, a routine duty that Quan performed once every season, that he saw her again. His father had recently expressed concern about the efficiency of the household staff, and Quan had volunteered to conduct a thorough review. He moved through the servant areas with the head steward, examining stores of supplies, checking the condition of workspaces, observing the daily operations that kept the palace functioning. Adia was in the laundry courtyard, part of a group of slave girls scrubbing linens in large wooden tubs. The work was hard, her arms were submerged in cold water, her hands red from the harsh soap, her back bent over the tub. When the prince's inspection party entered the courtyard, all the slaves immediately dropped to their knees, foreheads touching the ground in the required gesture of absolute submission. Quan's eyes found her immediately, though he tried to pretend otherwise. He listened to the head steward's explanations about the laundry schedule, about the recent improvement in soap quality, about the rotation of duties among the staff. But he was aware of her presence with every fiber of his being. Aware of the way her shoulders trembled slightly from cold or fear or exhaustion. Aware of the fact that she was kneeling on hard stone, her face pressed to the ground, waiting for him to pass. "You may rise and continue your work," the head steward announced to the slaves. They stood and returned to their tasks, keeping their eyes carefully averted. Adia moved back to her tub, plunging her hands into the water, focusing on the rhythm of scrubbing as if nothing else existed. But Quan saw the tension in her posture, the awareness that she was being observed. He should have moved on. Instead, he found himself asking the head steward, "How long has this one been in the palace?" The steward looked confused for a moment, following Quan's gaze to Adia. "The foreign girl? Perhaps 2 months, Your Highness. She was purchased for the queen consort's household, but has been assigned to general duties. She is learning the language and has given no trouble." "Where is she from?" The steward consulted with one of the supervisors, then reported, "From the far western lands, Your Highness. Beyond even the territories of the Persian traders." The merchant said something about the Dark Continent, though I cannot vouch for the accuracy of such claims. Africa. Though Quan had no precise knowledge of that land, he had seen maps that showed vast territories to the west and south of the known trade routes. It was almost unimaginably distant, which meant her journey to Scylla must have been a descent through circles of suffering he could barely conceive. "Is she skilled in any particular craft?" he asked, aware that each question made his interest more obvious, but unable to stop himself. The steward looked even more puzzled now. "She performs basic tasks adequately, Your Highness. Cleaning, laundry, serving. Nothing exceptional has been noted." "Is there a particular reason for Your Highness's inquiry?" The question contained a hint of caution, a subtle reminder that a crown prince showing interest in a slave girl was irregular at best and dangerous at worst. Quan recognized the warning and forced himself to step back. "No particular reason," he said coolly. "I am simply ensuring that we are making efficient use of all household resources. Continue with the inspection." They moved on to the next area, and Quan did not look back. But he could feel her presence behind him like a flame at his back, warm and dangerous and utterly compelling. That night, he lay awake in his chambers, staring at the painted ceiling where dragons and phoenixes danced in eternal patterns. He thought about destiny and duty, about the weight of blood and tradition, about the life that had been planned for him since before he could walk. And he thought about a girl kneeling in cold water, a girl who had been torn from her homeland and carried across the world to serve in a palace where no one even knew her name. He rose from his bed and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened palace grounds. Somewhere in those shadows, she slept on a thin mat in a crowded room, dreaming perhaps of a home she would never see again. The distance between his chambers and hers was not merely measured in steps, but in the unbridgeable gap between their positions in the world. He was the crown prince of Scylla. She was property. And yet something in him had awakened, something he had not known existed, something that whispered that the order of the world might not be as fixed and eternal as he had always believed. It was the most dangerous thought he had ever had. In the months that followed, Quan found himself manufacturing reasons to be in places where he might glimpse her. He took to walking through the palace gardens at unusual hours, telling himself he needed time for meditation and reflection. He visited parts of the palace he had never before paid attention to, always with some plausible official reason. He began to memorize the patterns of servant rotations, the schedules that governed who worked where and when. He was careful. He was discreet. But he was also obsessed in a way that both terrified and exhilarated him. Adia, for her part, began to notice something strange. The prince seemed to appear in her vicinity more often than coincidence could explain. At first, she thought it was her imagination, a trick of a mind desperate for something other than the grinding monotony of slave labor. But as the weeks passed, the pattern became undeniable. When she worked in the garden, he would walk past. When she carried water through certain corridors, he would happen to be there. When she served tea during council meetings, his eyes would rest on her for just a moment longer than necessary. It frightened her. It confused her. And, though she tried to deny it, it stirred something in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. She had learned enough of the language now to understand more of what was said around her, and she knew with absolute certainty that any connection between a crown prince and a slave girl would end in disaster. The best possible outcome would be that he would take her as a concubine, use her body for his pleasure, and discard her when he tired of the novelty. The more likely outcome would be punishment for both of them, her for daring to attract his attention, him for degrading himself with someone so far beneath his station. She should have done everything possible to avoid him. She should have requested a change in her duties, should have made herself invisible whenever he was near. But she found that she could not. When she knew he might walk through a certain garden, she found herself assigned to tasks in that area. When she heard he would be attending a meeting, she volunteered to serve tea. She told herself she was being foolish, that she was courting destruction, that she needed to protect herself from her own dangerous impulses. But the heart does not listen to such warnings. It was in the Garden of Contemplation, a place reserved for the royal family's private meditation, that they finally spoke again. Adia had been sent there to trim dead flowers from the bushes, a task that should have been completed before dawn when no one of importance would be present. But she had been delayed by other duties, and now she found herself working in the full light of morning, hoping to finish quickly and avoid notice. She was reaching for a withered blossom when she heard footsteps on the gravel path. She froze, then immediately dropped to her knees, pressing her forehead to the ground. She knew without looking that it was him. She could feel his presence the way one feels a change in the weather, a shift in the air that speaks of storm or sun. "Stand," he said quietly. She remained motionless, uncertain whether he was truly addressing her or whether this was some test. "I said stand," he repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the command. Slowly, she rose to her feet, keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must surely be able to hear it. "Look at me," he said. This was the most dangerous command of all. To look directly at the crown prince was a transgression that could be punished. But he had ordered it, and disobedience would be worse than presumption. She raised her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in full daylight. His face was as beautiful as she remembered, carved with the kind of perfection that seemed almost cruel, as if the gods had decided to make him exceptional in every possible way just to emphasize the impossibility of anything between them. But his eyes held something she had not expected: uncertainty, vulnerability, a kind of desperate questioning. "You have learned our language," he said. It was not a question, but an observation. "Some of it, Your Highness," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange in her mouth, the pronunciation imperfect but understandable. "What is your name?" It was the same question he had asked in the moonlight months ago, but now she could answer. Adia, your highness. Adia, he repeated, and the way he said it, with care, with attention to each syllable, made something inside her chest tighten painfully. What does it mean? Gift, she said. In my language, it means gift. He was silent for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression. A gift, he said softly. Were you a gift to your family? I was, your highness. Before I was taken. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. She had said too much, revealed too much. She should have kept her answer simple and neutral. But something about his attention, his genuine interest, had opened a door inside her that she had thought permanently sealed. Tell me about your homeland, he said. Your highness, I should return to my work. If I am found here. Tell me, he interrupted, and this time it was clearly a command, not a request. So she told him. In halting sentences, with vocabulary too limited to capture the full truth, she spoke of the green hills where she had grown up, of the goats she had tended, of her mother's hands grinding grain, of her brother's laughter. She spoke of the sky, so much wider than the sky here, she said, though she could not explain why it seemed that way. She spoke of the plants her mother had taught her to identify, of the songs the women sang while working, of the smell of rain on red earth. And as she spoke, he listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time since her capture, like a human being rather than an object. He asked questions about her village, about her family, about the journey that had brought her to Scylla. Some questions she could answer. Others were too painful, and she fell silent, and he did not press. They stood in that garden as the morning sun climbed higher, two people separated by every possible barrier yet connected by something neither of them fully understood. It was madness. It was dangerous. It was inevitable. Finally, he said, you should go. If someone finds us here like this. I know, your highness. Quan, he said suddenly. My name is Quan. She stared at him, shocked. For him to give her his personal name was an intimacy that transcended all boundaries. It was a gift more valuable than gold, more dangerous than poison. I cannot call you that, your highness, she whispered. Not where others can hear, he agreed. But here, when we are alone, he stopped, seeming to realize the implication of his words. When we are alone. As if there would be other times, other moments stolen from the rigid structure of their lives. This is madness, Adia said, and she could hear the fear in her own voice. What you are thinking, it cannot be. It will destroy us both. I know, he said. I know. I have told myself this 1,000 times. But tell me, he took a step closer, and she resisted the urge to step back. Tell me you do not feel it too. This thing between us. Tell me I am alone in this madness, and I will walk away and never speak to you again. She should have lied. Every instinct of survival screamed at her to lie, to break whatever was building between them before it became unbreakable. But she had been stripped of everything: her home, her family, her freedom, her name. She could not bring herself to surrender the truth as well. I feel it, she whispered. May the gods help me, I feel it too. The relief that flooded his face was almost painful to witness. He reached out as if to touch her, then stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. The space between them seemed to pulse with everything they could not say, could not do, could not have. We must be careful, he said finally. If my father discovers this, if the court finds out. I know, she said. I know what would happen. To both of us, but especially to me. I will not let anything happen to you, he said fiercely. I swear it. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that his power and position could protect her from the machinery of tradition and law that governed this kingdom. But she had seen too much, suffered too much, to indulge in such naive hope. You cannot make such promises, your highness. Quan, he corrected. Quan, she repeated, and the name felt sacred and profane all at once in her mouth. They heard voices approaching from another part of the garden, servants coming to tend to some task. Without another word, Adia dropped to her knees and returned to trimming the flowers, becoming once again invisible, a shadow among shadows. Quan walked away down a different path, his posture straight and princely, giving no indication that anything had passed between them. But everything had changed. They both knew it. The first crack had appeared in the wall that separated their worlds, and no amount of caution or denial would seal it again. From that day forward, they began to find ways to see each other. It required elaborate planning and careful choreography. Quan would send word through trusted servants about where he would walk and when. Adia would arrange to have duties in those areas. They developed signals, a particular way of folding a cloth, a flower left on a certain stone, a door left slightly ajar. They learned to communicate through glances and small gestures that would seem meaningless to observers. Their meetings were brief and infrequent, stolen moments in gardens or empty corridors, always with the awareness that discovery meant disaster. They spoke in whispers, standing far enough apart that no one could accuse them of impropriety, yet close enough that they could hear each other's breathing. She told him stories of her homeland. He told her about the weight of being a crown prince, about the loneliness of a life where every action was scrutinized, every choice made for him before he could make it himself. "Sometimes I think I am not a person at all," he confessed to her one evening in a dim corridor where shadows gave them brief privacy. "I am a symbol, a vessel for the kingdom's hopes and traditions. I do not have thoughts of my own, I have duties. I do not have feelings, I have responsibilities." "But you do have feelings," Adia said softly. "I see them when you speak to me. You are more real in these moments than anyone else I have encountered in this palace. Perhaps that is because you see me as no one else does. To everyone else, I am the crown prince. To you, I am simply Quan," she finished. He smiled, and it transformed his face from something carved from marble into something warm and living. She had never seen him smile before, not like this, not with such unguarded joy. It made her chest ache with emotions she could not name. They were falling in love, though neither of them said the words. To speak them aloud would be to acknowledge the impossibility of their situation, to give shape to a thing that could only survive in silence. But the love grew anyway, fed by stolen glances and whispered conversations, by the desperate knowledge that each meeting might be their last. Okja noticed the change in Adia, though she could not have identified its source. The girl moved through her duties with the same efficiency as always, but there was something different in her bearing, something almost like hope. It worried Okja, who had lived long enough to know that hope was a dangerous thing for a slave. "You must be careful," Okja said to her one night as they prepared for sleep. She spoke in the simple language they had developed together, a mixture of Korean words and gestures. "I see you. I see something changing. Whatever it is, it will bring trouble." Adia wanted to deny it, but she could not bring herself to lie to the woman who had shown her the only kindness she had known in this place. "I am being careful," she said instead. "Not careful enough," Okja replied. "Others are noticing too. There are whispers. Be more careful than you think you need to be. The palace has many eyes and more mouths." The warning chilled Adia, but she could not heed it. She was already caught in something larger than caution, something that felt like destiny or doom or both at once. And in his chambers across the palace, Quan lay awake thinking the same thoughts, knowing he should end this before it went further, knowing he would not. Could not. The heart, once awakened, does not easily return to sleep. The palace that spring seemed to bloom with conspiracy. It began subtly, a noble who had noticed the crown prince's distraction, a servant who had seen him linger too long near certain areas, a courtier who made a mental note of patterns where none should exist. In a place where power was currency and information was power, nothing remained secret for long. Lord Min, the father of Lady Xiaoyun and the most influential noble in the court, was among the first to sense something amiss. He had not survived decades of political maneuvering without developing an instinct for anomalies, and Prince Kwan's recent behavior qualified as deeply anomalous. The prince had always been punctual, focused, entirely predictable in his devotion to duty. But lately, he had been distracted during meetings, sometimes arriving late, occasionally declining invitations that he would normally have accepted without question. Lord Min said nothing directly, but he began to watch more carefully. He had too much invested in the marriage alliance between his daughter and the crown prince to allow any threat to materialize unchecked. His spies, and he had many, servants who owed him loyalty purchased with silver or fear, began to pay closer attention to the prince's movements. Lady Silla herself noticed the change in her betrothed. During their formal meetings to discuss wedding arrangements, he seemed elsewhere, his responses perfunctory, his attention scattered. She was not a fool, despite the delicate appearance cultivated by years of training in feminine accomplishments. She had been raised to be a queen, which meant she had been educated in observation, strategy, and the maintenance of power. Whatever was distracting Prince Kwan represented a potential threat to her future, and she intended to identify and eliminate it. "My lord seems troubled," she said to him one afternoon as they walked through the palace gardens under the watchful eyes of chaperones. It was one of their required pre-wedding promenades, an opportunity for them to become acquainted under appropriate supervision. "Do I?" Quan responded, forcing his attention back to her. "I apologize. I have been preoccupied with matters of state." "Of course," she said smoothly. "Though I wonder if there might be something else weighing on your mind. Perhaps something of a more personal nature." The question was delicate but pointed. Quan glanced at her, recognizing the intelligence behind her carefully painted face. "What makes you suggest such a thing?" "Only that you seem different lately. More distracted. As your future wife, I hope you know that you can confide in me about anything that troubles you. We are to be partners in ruling this kingdom, after all." It was a reasonable statement, delivered with appropriate concern. But Quan heard the warning beneath it. She was observing him, noting his changes, and she would not remain ignorant forever. He felt a surge of resentment at the presumption that she had any right to his inner life, followed immediately by guilt. She had done nothing wrong. She was exactly what she had been raised to be, exactly what his father and her father and the entire kingdom expected her to be. The fault, if there was fault, lay in him for wanting something different. "You are kind to be concerned," he said carefully. "But I assure you, there is nothing that need worry you. The responsibilities of my position sometimes weigh heavily, that is all." She smiled, a perfect curve of lips that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "Of course, my lord. I understand completely." But she did not understand, and more importantly, she did not believe him. That evening, she instructed her personal maid, a woman who had served her family since childhood and whose loyalty was absolute, to increase surveillance of the prince's activities. She wanted to know where he went, whom he saw, what might be causing this distraction. If there was another woman, a noble daughter trying to interfere with the arranged marriage, Lady Silla would crush the threat before it could take root. She had not spent her entire life preparing to be queen only to be displaced by some ambitious rival. The net was tightening, though Quan and Adia did not yet realize it. They continued their careful dance, meeting in shadows, speaking in whispers, falling deeper into something they both knew was impossible. They had progressed beyond conversation now. When they met, they stood closer. Their hands would brush, seemingly by accident, and linger. They found reasons to touch, him adjusting a flower in her hair, her steadying him when he stumbled on uneven ground, small gestures that carried the weight of everything they could not say or do. It was during one of these meetings, in a storage room rarely used at night, that they first kissed. Neither of them planned it. They had been speaking in low voices about nothing important, simply sharing each other's presence, when their eyes met in the dim light of a single lamp. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with all the restraint they had practiced for months. "We should not," Adia whispered, though she did not move away. "I know," Quan replied, but he was leaning toward her, his hand rising to cup her face with a gentleness that made her eyes sting with tears. When their lips finally met, it was like the breaking of a dam. All the careful control, all the maintained distance, all the rational arguments against what they were doing, everything dissolved in that moment. The kiss was hungry and desperate and tender all at once, a conversation without words about need and fear and belonging. When they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. Adia pressed her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart race beneath silk and muscle. "This is madness," she said, though it was the 1,000th time she had said those words, and they had never stopped anything. "Then let me be mad," he replied, his arms tightening around her. I have spent my entire life being rational, being controlled, being what everyone else needs me to be. For these moments, let me simply be yours." It was the closest either of them had come to speaking the truth aloud, that they were no longer playing at attraction or indulging in curiosity. They were in love, deeply and completely, in a way that recognized no boundaries of rank or race or law. But the palace had noticed. Servants whispered to other servants. A eunuch mentioned to a courtier that he had seen the prince near the storage rooms at odd hours. A kitchen worker noted that the African slave girl was often absent from her quarters after dark. The pieces were scattered, but those whose business was collecting pieces and assembling them into pictures were beginning to see the outline of something scandalous. It was Lord Cho, a rival to Lord Min and a man who nursed his own ambitions, who first brought the rumors to King Jaegeum's attention. He did so carefully, framing it as concern for the crown prince's reputation rather than accusation. "Your Majesty," he said during a private audience, "I hesitate to bring this matter to your attention, but my loyalty to the throne compels me to speak. There have been observations regarding Prince Kwan's activities within the palace." King Jaegeum looked up from the state documents he had been reviewing, his expression revealing nothing. He was a man who had learned long ago to conceal his reactions until he understood the full scope of any situation. "What manner of observations?" "It pains me to say this, Your Majesty, but there are suggestions that the prince has been meeting secretly with one of the palace slaves. A foreign girl, I am told. The meetings appear to be frequent and conducted with great secrecy, which naturally raises questions about their nature." The king's face remained impassive, but his hands stilled on the documents. "These are serious accusations, Lord Cho. I trust you have evidence beyond palace gossip." "I would not bring mere gossip to your Majesty's attention," Lord Cho replied smoothly. "My sources have observed the prince on multiple occasions in areas where he has no official business, at hours when he should be elsewhere. The slave girl in question has similarly been absent from her assigned duties at times that coincide with the prince's movements. I have taken the liberty of compiling dates and locations." He produced a scroll. King Jaegeum accepted the scroll but did not open it. "Leave me," he said. "I will investigate this matter personally." Lord Cho bowed and withdrew, satisfied that he had planted the seed. Whether it grew into a tree that destroyed Lord Min's marriage alliance or simply embarrassed the crown prince enough to create political opportunity, either outcome served his purposes. Alone in his chambers, King Jaegeum finally opened the scroll and read the careful documentation of his son's secret meetings. His face remained expressionless, but inside, a cold fury was building. Not at the potential scandal, though that was bad enough. Not even at the apparent relationship with a slave, though that was an abomination against every tradition the kingdom held sacred. What angered him most was the weakness it represented, the dangerous sentimentality that would undermine everything he had built. He had raised his son to be stronger than this. He had poured decades of teaching into making Quan into the perfect heir, disciplined, strategic, immune to the kinds of emotional entanglements that destroyed kingdoms. And yet here was evidence that all that training had failed. His son, the future king of Silla, had allowed himself to become entangled with a slave girl, a foreigner, someone so far beneath him that the very fact of her existence in his thoughts was an insult to the throne. King Jaegeum made a decision. He would not confront his son directly, not yet. That would only force Quan into a defensive position and potentially make him more stubborn. Instead, he would remove the temptation. The slave girl would be dealt with quietly, and his son would learn a lesson about the cost of weakness. He summoned the head steward and gave orders that were brief and absolute. The foreign slave girl was to be transferred immediately to the far provinces, to a military outpost where she would work in the kitchens of soldiers stationed at the border. She was to be sent within 3 days, with no warning, no preparation, and no possibility of return. The matter was to be handled discreetly, no public announcement, no explanation to other servants. She would simply disappear. The head steward bowed and withdrew to carry out the orders. He felt no particular emotion about the matter. Slaves were transferred all the time for various reasons. This was merely another administrative task. But news travels quickly through servant networks, especially when it concerns one of their own. Within hours, Okja had heard whispers of the transfer order. She did not know the reason behind it, but she knew it could not be coincidence that Adia, who had been quietly drawing dangerous attention, was suddenly being sent away to one of the harshest postings imaginable. She found Adia that evening in the servants' quarters and pulled her aside. "You must listen to me carefully," she said in their shared language of gestures and simple words. "There is an order. You are being sent away. 3 days. To the northern border." Adia felt the blood drain from her face. "Why? What have I done?" "You know what you have done," Okja said, not unkindly. "Or rather, what you have been seen doing. I warned you. The palace has eyes everywhere." "I have to see him," Adia said desperately. "I have to warn him." "No," Okja said firmly, gripping her arm. "That is the worst thing you could do. If you are caught trying to reach the prince now, the punishment will be severe. Not just transfer, execution. For both of you, perhaps. You must accept what is happening and survive it." "I cannot just disappear without a word." "You can and you will," Okja interrupted. "You have no choice. The border posting is harsh, but it is life. Any other path leads to death. Do you understand me?" Adia understood, but understanding did not make it bearable. That night, she lay awake on her mat, her mind racing. 3 days. She had 3 days before she would be taken from the palace, from Quan, from the impossible love that had somehow become the center of her existence. The border posting might as well be death. It was a place of constant danger, brutal cold, minimal food, and no hope of return. Slaves sent to military outposts rarely survived more than a few years. She had to find a way to tell him. Even if it was dangerous, even if it risked everything, she could not let him think she had simply abandoned him. Their love might be doomed, but it deserved a farewell. The next day, working with trembling hands, she managed to leave a message in one of their signal locations, a small garden pavilion where Quan sometimes walked in the early morning. She used a system they had developed, arranging flowers in a pattern that meant urgent meeting needed. She did not know if he would see it, did not know if he would be able to come, but it was all she could do. Quan found the signal that afternoon. His heart clenched when he saw it. Adia never used the urgent signal unless something was desperately wrong. He immediately began planning how to reach their usual meeting place without drawing attention. But he was not quick enough. That evening, as he prepared to slip away from the formal dinner under some pretext, his father summoned him to a private audience. Quan went, thinking it was merely another administrative matter, another lecture about his responsibilities. He did not realize he was walking into an ambush. King Jaigiam was waiting in his private study, standing before a window that looked out over the palace grounds. He did not turn when Quan entered and bowed. "Your Highness," Quan said formally. "You summoned me." "I did," the king replied, his voice cold. "Close the door." Quan did so, a sense of foreboding creeping up his spine. His father's tone was familiar. It was the voice he used before delivering punishment. "I have received disturbing reports," King Jaigiam said, still not turning from the window. "Reports that suggest my son and heir has been conducting himself in a manner unworthy of his position." Quan's mouth went dry. "Father, I don't understand." "Do not insult my intelligence with lies," the king interrupted, finally turning to face him. His expression was carved from stone. "You have been meeting secretly with a slave. A foreign slave. Do you deny it?" The world seemed to tilt. Quan felt as if he were falling through space. He opened his mouth, searching for a denial, an explanation, anything that might deflect this disaster. But he had never been good at lying, especially to his father. He began, then stopped. "The slave has been transferred," King Jaigiam continued. "She leaves for the northern border tomorrow at dawn. This matter is finished. We will not speak of it again. Tomorrow." The word burst from Quan before he could stop himself. "Father, you cannot." "I cannot." The king's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "You dare tell me what I can and cannot do? I am the Wang. This is my kingdom. And you are my heir, bound by responsibilities you seem to have forgotten." That slave was a distraction, a temptation that nearly led you into disgrace. I have removed it. You should be grateful. She is not an it, Quan said, and he heard his own voice rising, all his carefully cultivated control shattering. She is a person. She has a name. She has thoughts and feelings and… Enough. King Jaigiam's roar shook the room. Listen to yourself. You sound like a fool, like a child who has confused lust for love. This is exactly what I feared, that you would allow weakness to corrupt your judgment. That girl is property. She is no more capable of love than a horse or a dog. Whatever you think you feel is illusion, sentiment, the kind of soft-headed romanticism that destroys dynasties. You're wrong, Quan said, and he was shaking now, with anger and fear and desperate grief. You're wrong about her. You're wrong about what we feel. I love her, father. I love her, and she loves me, and sending her away will not change that. The silence that followed was terrible. King Jaigiam stared at his son as if looking at a stranger. You love a slave, he said finally, his voice flat. You, the crown prince of Scylla, the heir to a throne that has stood for generations, claim to love a foreign slave girl. Yes, Quan said, and there was something almost liberating in finally speaking the truth aloud, even in this moment of catastrophe. Yes, I love her. Then you are a greater fool than I thought, his father said coldly. And I see that removing the girl is not sufficient. You require a stronger lesson. You will marry Lady Xiaoyun within the month. The wedding date is moved forward. You will produce an heir. You will perform your duty. And if I hear even a whisper of your attempting to contact that slave, I will have her executed. Do you understand me? Not transferred, executed. Her blood will be on your hands if you do not master yourself. The threat hit Quan like a physical blow. He understood immediately that his father was not bluffing. King Jaigiam was capable of extraordinary cruelty when he believed it served the state. He had executed rivals, eliminated threats, sacrificed thousands in war without losing sleep. One slave girl's life would mean nothing to him. You would murder an innocent woman to control me? Quan asked, his voice hollow. I would do whatever is necessary to ensure my son does not destroy himself and this kingdom with misguided sentiment, King Jaigiam replied. The choice is yours. Forget her, marry Lady Xiaoyun, become the king you were born to be. Or pursue this madness and watch her die. Those are your only options. Quan felt something break inside him. All his life, he had obeyed his father. All his life, he had placed duty above everything else. But this was asking him to cut out his own heart and pretend the wound did not exist. May I be excused, he asked, his voice barely functioning. You are dismissed, the king said. Remember what I have told you. Her life is in your hands. Quan walked from the room like a man in a dream. He moved through corridors that seemed unfamiliar, past guards who might as well have been statues. His mind was a chaos of grief and rage and desperation. Adia was leaving at dawn. He had hours, perhaps less, to find a way to see her, to warn her, to say goodbye. But his father's threat hung over everything. Any contact between them would sentence her to death. He should stay away. He should let her go, let her live, even if it meant living without her. It was the rational choice, the responsible choice, the choice a future king should make. But he had spent his entire life making the responsible choice, and it had led him here to a moment where he had to choose between the woman he loved and everything he had been raised to become. He made his decision. Just before dawn, he slipped from his chambers dressed in the simple clothes of a servant. He moved through the palace using routes he had memorized during his months of secret meetings. The guards were changing shifts, a moment of vulnerability in the security he had noted long ago. He reached the servants' quarters without being seen and found Okja emerging from the sleeping room. She saw him, and her eyes widened in horror. Your Highness, you cannot be here. Where is she? He demanded in a whisper. Already gone, Okja said. They came for her an hour ago. She is in the courtyard with the guards who will escort her north. Your Highness, you must leave. If you are discovered here. But Quan was already moving toward the courtyard. Okja tried to stop him, but he shook her off gently and continued. He reached a window that looked down into the courtyard, and there she was, Adia, standing between two armed guards, a small bundle of belongings in her hands. Even from a distance, he could see that she had been crying. He wanted to run to her, to sweep her up and escape the palace, to find some place where they could be together without the weight of kingdoms and traditions crushing them. But he knew it was fantasy. There was nowhere they could go, no life they could build. His father's reach was long, and his determination was absolute. Instead, he simply watched her, memorizing her face, her posture, the way she stood with dignity despite her chains. She looked up suddenly, as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the distance. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, he saw her expression change, hope and grief and love all mingled together. He pressed his hand against the window, a gesture meaningless and profound. She raised her own hand in response, a tiny movement the guards did not notice. And in that moment, they said everything they could not speak aloud. Goodbye. I love you. Remember me. This is not over, even though it must be over. The guards gave a command, and Adia was led toward the gates. Quan watched until she disappeared from view, until he could no longer see even the shadow of her presence. Then he stood there in the growing light, his hand still pressed against the window, feeling as if his soul had been torn from his body and carried away into the dawn. He returned to his chambers unseen. He sat on the edge of his bed and stared at nothing. When servants came to prepare him for the day, he responded mechanically. When he was summoned to begin wedding preparations, he went. When Lady Seoyeon spoke to him, he answered. But he was not truly present. Some essential part of him had left with Adia, heading north toward a harsh outpost where slaves died of cold and hunger and the casual violence of soldiers. He had lost her. And in losing her, he discovered that he had never truly known what pain was until this moment. All the training, all the discipline, all the armor he had built around himself, none of it was proof against this agony. But even in the depths of his grief, a small flame of defiance remained burning. His father thought this was finished, thought that distance and threats and duty would smother whatever had grown between the crown prince and the slave girl. King Jaegeum had underestimated two things: the depth of Quan's love and his own son's capacity for patience and strategy. Quan would obey for now. He would marry Lady Seoyeon. He would play his role. But he had not forgotten everything he had learned about strategy and long-term planning. His father would not live forever. And when Quan ascended to the throne, when he became the Wang with absolute authority, he would remake the kingdom. He would find Adia. He would bring her home. And he would ensure that no one else suffered what they had suffered. It was a promise he made to himself in the darkness of his grief. It sustained him through the weeks that followed, through the wedding ceremony where he spoke vows to a woman he did not love, through the political celebrations and formal duties, through nights when Lady Seoyeon's presence in his bed felt like a betrayal of everything real inside him. He waited. He planned. He endured. And far to the north, in a military outpost where the wind cut like knives and the work was brutal and the soldiers treated the slaves with casual cruelty, Adia also endured. She thought of Quan every day. She remembered his face, his voice, the way he had looked at her as if she were precious rather than worthless. She survived because she had survived before, because she was stronger than anyone knew, and because hope, even impossible hope, is sometimes enough to keep a heart beating. Neither of them knew how long they would have to wait. Neither of them knew if they would survive long enough to see each other again. But they both knew that what had passed between them was not finished. It could not be finished, any more than the sun could be commanded not to rise. Love, once kindled in hearts willing to risk everything, does not easily die. Even when surrounded by darkness, it finds a way to burn. The years that followed were a study in endurance. Quan learned to wear a mask so perfect that even those closest to him could not see beneath it. He performed his duties as crown prince with the precision of a master craftsman. He attended councils and made decisions that earned his father's grudging approval. He led military campaigns against border raiders and returned victorious. He stood beside Lady Seoyeon at state functions, presenting the image of a harmonious royal couple. But beneath the surface, he was planning. He began to study the kingdom's laws with new intensity, particularly those governing slavery, property rights, and royal prerogatives. He cultivated relationships with reform-minded nobles, carefully identifying those who might support changes to ancient traditions. He built alliances among the military commanders, earning their loyalty through competence and fair treatment. He waited for his moment with the patience of a man who knows that premature action means death. Lady Scylla was not fooled by his performance. She had married him knowing he did not love her, but she had expected that he would at least try to build something resembling a partnership. Instead, she found herself living with a ghost, a man who went through all the motions of married life while remaining fundamentally absent. He was never cruel, never openly neglectful, but he was never truly present either. She produced the required heir within the first year of their marriage, a son who was celebrated throughout the kingdom as the future of the dynasty. Then another son 2 years later, securing the succession. She fulfilled every duty expected of her, and still she could not reach the man she had married. It was like living with a beautiful statue, perfectly formed but fundamentally cold. Sometimes, late at night when he thought she was asleep, she would hear him rise and move to the window, standing there for hours looking north. She knew he was thinking of the slave girl, the foreign woman who had somehow captured what Lady Scylla herself, with all her beauty and accomplishment, could never touch. The knowledge was bitter, but she was too proud to confront him. Instead, she poured her energy into raising their sons, into maintaining her position at court, into preparing for the day when she would be queen. She also began to build her own power base, separate from her husband. She cultivated relationships with the noble families, particularly the women who wielded influence through their husbands and sons. She established herself as a patron of scholars and artists, earning respect for her intelligence and taste. She made sure that when the transition of power came, she would be more than just a decorative consort, she would be a force to be reckoned with. In the north, Adia's survival was a daily battle. The outpost was a place of perpetual hardship, perched on a windswept plain where winter lasted 8 months and summer was brief and grudging. The soldiers stationed there were rough men, hardened by constant vigilance against raids from northern tribes. They treated the slaves who served them with contempt at best and cruelty at worst. Adia worked in the kitchens, hauling water from a frozen stream, preparing food over smoking fires, scrubbing pots until her hands bled. The other slaves were a mix of peoples, local criminals, captured raiders, debtors sold into service. Most did not survive their first year. The combination of hard labor, inadequate food, brutal cold, and the casual violence of soldiers created a mortality rate that would have shocked anyone in the capital, had anyone there cared to notice. But Adia had learned something about survival during her first captivity, during the terrible journey that had brought her to Silla. She knew how to make herself useful enough to be kept alive, but not so attractive as to draw dangerous attention. She knew how to endure pain without breaking. She knew how to keep her spirit alive even when her body was pushed to its limits. More importantly, she had something that many of the other slaves lacked: a reason to survive. Every day, she thought of Quan. Every night, she remembered his promise that he would find a way. She did not know if he could keep that promise. She did not even know if he was still alive. But the possibility, however remote, was enough to keep her moving forward when everything else screamed that she should simply give up and die. She learned the northern language from the other slaves, adding it to her growing collection of tongues. She learned which soldiers were merely indifferent and which were actively cruel, adjusting her behavior accordingly. She learned to find small moments of beauty even in this harsh place, the way frost formed intricate patterns on stones, the sight of birds migrating overhead, the taste of a piece of dried fruit hoarded and saved for days. These tiny victories against despair became her daily practice. 3 years into her exile, something unexpected happened. The outpost commander, a career soldier named Colonel Han, fell ill with a fever that the garrison physician could not treat. He hovered near death for days while his subordinates prepared for the succession of command. Adia, who had learned herb lore from her mother and had expanded that knowledge by observing the local plants, recognized his symptoms as similar to an illness she had seen in her homeland. She approached the physician, a risky act, as slaves were not supposed to offer advice to their betters. But she had reached a point where she had little left to lose. Through careful gestures and her limited vocabulary, she conveyed that she might know a treatment. The physician, desperate and having exhausted his own remedies, allowed her to prepare a medicine from plants she had identified in the surrounding area. The colonel recovered. It was not a miracle. The fever might have broken on its own, or the plants might have had genuine medicinal properties, or some combination of factors might have contributed. But Colonel Han, a practical man who believed in results rather than theories, credited Adia with saving his life. From that point forward, her situation improved marginally. She was given slightly better rations, assigned to less brutal tasks, and protected from the worst excesses of the soldiers' behavior. It was not freedom, not even close to comfort, but it was survival with slightly less suffering. And it gave her hope that she might live long enough to see if Quan kept his promise. In the capital, time moved differently. King Jaegeum grew older, though he remained formidable. Quan grew into his role as crown prince with a competence that impressed even his father's harshest critics. The kingdom prospered under stable leadership. Trade routes expanded. Military threats were neutralized. The dynasty seemed secure. But beneath the surface of stability, change was gathering. A new generation of nobles had grown up with different ideas about governance and tradition. Scholars debated questions about justice and human dignity. Even among the common people, there were whispers of discontent about the treatment of slaves, about the rigidity of the class system, about whether the old ways were truly as eternal as everyone claimed. Quan listened to these whispers. He encouraged them subtly, never so overtly that his father would notice, but creating space for new ideas to circulate. He promoted younger officials who showed reformist leanings. He quietly supported scholars whose work questioned traditional assumptions. He was building a foundation for the changes he planned to implement when he finally had the power to do so. He also began, carefully and through the most trusted intermediaries, to make inquiries about the northern outposts. He wanted to know conditions, mortality rates, who was stationed where. He wanted to know if a particular slave girl from Africa was still alive. The information came back slowly, pieced together from various sources over months and years. But eventually, he learned that she had survived. More than survived, she had somehow made herself indispensable to the outpost command. The knowledge that she was alive, that she was enduring just as he was enduring, gave him strength. Their separation was not permanent. It was simply a trial they had to pass through before they could be reunited. He believed this with a faith that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the force of will that had always defined him. In the 8th year after Adia's exile, King Jaegeum's health began to fail. It started subtly, a cough that would not clear, a loss of appetite, a fatigue that rest could not cure. The royal physicians attempted various treatments, but the king was 70 years old, and his body was simply wearing out. He had ruled for 43 years, longer than most kings of Scylla, and he had poured every ounce of his energy into maintaining the kingdom's strength and stability. As he weakened, he summoned Quan for a final conversation. They met in the king's private chambers, a place Quan had entered countless times over his life, usually to receive instruction or criticism. But this time was different. His father looked small in the large bed, diminished by illness, yet his eyes still held that fierce intelligence and uncompromising will. "You will be king soon," Jaegeum said, his voice rough. "I will not pretend otherwise. The physicians give me weeks at most." "Father, you should rest," Quan began, but the king waved him to silence. "I will rest soon enough. For eternity. Before that happens, I need to know that you are ready. That you understand what is required of a king." "I understand," Quan said. "Do you?" The king's gaze was piercing. "Do you understand that the throne is not yours to use for personal satisfaction? That every decision you make must serve the kingdom, not your own desires? That sentiment is a luxury a king cannot afford." Quan recognized what this was truly about, his father's final attempt to ensure that the lesson about Adia had been learned, that his son would not pursue the forbidden love that had once threatened to derail everything. I understand that a king's duty is to his people, Quan said carefully. I understand that tradition and stability have their value. But I also understand that traditions can change. That stability built on injustice is not true stability. That a king who does not have the courage to question the way things have always been is not leading, he is merely presiding over slow decay. King Jaegeum stared at his son for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he smiled, a bitter, knowing expression. You have not forgotten her. After all these years, after marriage and children and responsibility, you have not forgotten that slave girl. Quan met his father's gaze steadily. I have not forgotten. And when I am dead, when you are king, you intend to pursue this madness? When I am king, I intend to rule with wisdom and justice. What that means, I will determine. The king laughed, a sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he looked at his son with something that might have been respect or might have been despair. You are stubborn. I raised you to be strong, but perhaps I made you too strong. Too willing to trust your own judgment over the accumulated wisdom of generations. You raised me to think for myself, Quan countered. To analyze situations and make strategic decisions. I am doing exactly what you taught me to do. Clever, the king acknowledged. Using my own teachings against me. Perhaps you will make a good king after all, even if not the kind I envisioned. But hear me now, my son. If you do this thing you are contemplating, if you bring that girl back, if you disrupt the social order, if you challenge traditions that have kept this kingdom strong, you will face opposition such as you cannot imagine. The nobles will resist. The people will be shocked. You may lose everything in pursuit of this one thing. I know, Quan said. I have had 8 years to consider the consequences. I will face them when they come. King Jaegeum closed his eyes, suddenly looking exhausted. Then I can only hope that your love proves strong enough to justify the chaos it will unleash. Leave me now. I wish to rest. Quan bowed and withdrew. It was the last substantive conversation they had. 3 weeks later, King Jaegeum died in his sleep, and the kingdom entered the formal period of mourning that preceded a new king's ascension. The transition of power in Scylla was an elaborate affair, governed by rituals that had been performed for centuries. There was a mourning period of 100 days during which the new king could not formally take the throne. Then came the coronation ceremony, the acceptance of pledges from the noble houses, the assumption of the royal regalia. Quan moved through all of this with the same careful control he had practiced for years, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts or plans. But once he was truly king, once the power was undeniably his, he began to act. His first move was subtle, a proclamation establishing a royal commission to review the kingdom's laws regarding slavery. It was framed as a routine administrative matter, an attempt to ensure that existing laws were being properly enforced and that no abuses were occurring. Most of the nobles assumed it was merely performative, a young king showing concern for justice without intending any real change. But Quan stacked the commission with reformist scholars and fair-minded officials. He gave them broad authority to investigate conditions, interview slaves, and recommend changes. And he made it clear in private meetings that he expected substantive findings and bold recommendations. His second move was more direct. He summoned Colonel Han from the northern outpost to the capital for consultations on border security. It was a reasonable request. The colonel was an experienced commander with valuable knowledge. But Quan had a secondary purpose. During their private meeting, after discussing military matters, he raised a different topic. I understand you have a slave in your garrison who has some medical knowledge, Quan said. An African woman. Colonel Han looked surprised. Yes, Your Majesty. She once treated me for fever. She has been useful in that regard, though I confess I do not know how she acquired such skills. I am interested in establishing a more systematic approach to medical care throughout the kingdom, Quan said, which was true, though not the whole truth. I would like to interview slaves who have demonstrated healing abilities, to learn what knowledge they possess that might be formalized and taught. I wish you to send this woman to the capital for such an interview. The colonel hesitated. Your Majesty, she is valuable to the outpost. The conditions there are harsh, and her ability to treat illness has saved lives. I understand. But I am the king, and the kingdom's needs take precedence. You will be compensated for her loss with 2 replacement slaves of your choosing. Send her within the month." The colonel had no choice but to agree. Quan dismissed him and allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something like hope. Adia was coming back. After 8 years of separation, 8 years of endurance and planning and waiting, they would be in the same place again. But he knew that bringing her back was only the first step. The truly difficult part lay ahead, finding a way for them to be together without sparking a rebellion, a scandal, or a crisis that could topple his newly established reign. When Adia received the order that she was being transferred back to the capital, she did not believe it at first. Slaves were almost never recalled from border postings. It was usually a life sentence, ending only in death. But Colonel Han confirmed it. She was to be escorted to the royal palace for some purpose involving the king's interest in medical knowledge. The journey south took 3 weeks. With each day that brought her closer to the capital, her emotions grew more complex. Fear warred with hope. She had survived 8 years in the harshest conditions imaginable, but she had no idea what awaited her in the palace. Did Quan even remember her? He was king now, married with children, surrounded by power and responsibility. Perhaps he had moved on, and this summons had nothing to do with their ancient love at all. But then she remembered the way he had looked at her through the window on that terrible morning, the silent promise in his gesture. She remembered his voice when he had said her name, the gentleness of his touch, the fierce declaration that he loved her. If there was any chance that he had kept faith as she had kept faith, then she had to hold on to hope. She arrived at the palace gates in the early evening of the first day of autumn. The guards processed her transfer papers, assigned her to temporary quarters, and instructed her to report to the medical offices the next morning. She spent that first night back in the palace barely sleeping, her mind a chaos of memories and possibilities. The next morning, she was escorted not to medical offices, but to a private garden, the same garden where Quan had first spoken to her, where she had knelt by a stone basin washing tea bowls in the moonlight 9 years ago. Her escort, a eunuch with a carefully neutral expression, left her there alone with instructions to wait. She stood in the garden, hardly daring to breathe. The place had not changed. The same carefully arranged stones, the same pruned trees, the same sense of timeless peace. But she had changed. 9 years had marked her, aged her, hardened her in ways both visible and invisible. She was no longer the frightened 17-year-old girl who had just arrived in this foreign land. She was a woman who had survived horrors and endured what should have broken her. She heard footsteps on the gravel path and turned. And there he was. Quan had changed too. The years had refined his features, added weight to his bearing, given his presence an authority that went beyond mere rank. He wore the robes of a king now, and power sat on him like a second skin. But his eyes held the same desperate longing she remembered, the same fierce devotion that had sustained her through the darkest years. They stood looking at each other across the distance of the garden path, and the weight of 8 years of separation seemed to compress into a single moment of recognition. Then he was moving toward her, and she was moving toward him, and they met in the center of the garden, and suddenly his arms were around her and hers around him, and they were both shaking with the force of emotions too large for words. "You came back," he whispered against her hair. "You survived. I did not dare to hope, but you survived." "I survived for this," she said, her voice breaking. "For the possibility of this moment. I did not know if you could still. I never stopped," he said fiercely, pulling back to look at her face. "Not for one day. Not for 1 hour. You have been with me through everything, Adia. Every decision I made, every plan I laid, every breath I took was toward this moment." She touched his face, hardly believing he was real, that this was not some fevered dream born of desperation and hope. "You are king now." "I am king now," he agreed. "Which means I finally have the power to change things. To make it possible for us to be together. Your people will never accept me," she said, voicing the fear that had haunted her thoughts since learning of her transfer. "I am a slave. A foreigner. Everything you are not supposed to choose. Then I will teach them to accept it," he said with the absolute certainty that had always been part of his nature. I did not wait 8 years to have you back just to hide you in the shadows. I mean to make you my queen, Adia. I mean to abolish slavery throughout the kingdom. I mean to prove that love and justice can coexist, that tradition can be challenged when it serves cruelty. She stared at him, overwhelmed by the scope of what he was proposing. You will destroy yourself. The nobles will revolt. The people will reject me. You will lose everything. I will lose everything if I do not try, he countered. These years without you have taught me that there are things more important than stability, more valuable than tradition. You are one of those things. Justice is another. I will not rule a kingdom built on the suffering of people like you, purchased and sold and treated as less than human. If I am to be king, I will be a king worthy of the throne. And that means being worthy of you. I am still a slave, she said, touching the bronze collar that still circled her neck, the mark of her bondage that had been part of her for so long she sometimes forgot it was there. He reached up and, with a gesture both tender and symbolic, unfastened the collar. It fell away, and she gasped at the strange lightness, the sudden absence of weight she had carried for 9 years. You are no longer a slave, he said, his voice formal now, investing the words with royal authority. By the power vested in me as king of Scylla, I declare you free. You owe no service, bear no debt, belong to no master. You are Adia, a free woman, and if you will have me, you will be more, you will be my queen. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, all the grief and hope and love of 9 years pouring out in a way she could not control or contain. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will have you. I will be whatever you need me to be. Your queen, your partner, your wife. Yes. They kissed then, and it was like coming home after years of exile, like finding water after endless thirst, like waking from a nightmare into sunlight. The garden around them seemed to hold its breath, as if the ancient stones and trees recognized the significance of this moment. A king and a former slave, choosing each other despite everything, beginning a transformation that would reshape a kingdom. But their moment of peace was brief. Even as they stood together, plans had to be made, strategies developed, allies secured. The journey from this private declaration to public acceptance would be treacherous. Quan knew that his nobles would resist, that some would see this as a betrayal of everything the kingdom stood for. He knew that Lady Xiaoyun, still his legal wife, still the mother of his heirs, would be humiliated. He knew that the scandal would be enormous. But he had spent 8 years preparing for this moment. He had built alliances with reform-minded nobles. He had cultivated the military's loyalty. He had laid the groundwork through his commission on slavery for broader changes in the kingdom's laws. He had the power of the throne, the mandate of royal authority, and the will to use both. Over the weeks that followed, he began to implement his plan. First, he elevated Adia's status officially. She was given chambers in the palace, assigned attendants, provided with clothing appropriate for someone of high rank. He announced that she was under his personal protection and that any disrespect shown to her would be considered disrespect to the throne itself. It was a clear signal that something unusual was happening, and the court buzzed with speculation. Then he called a meeting of the noble council and made his announcement. He explained that he intended to take Adia as his second wife, in accordance with the ancient custom that allowed kings multiple marriages. He acknowledged that this was unprecedented given her background, but he framed it as a demonstration of the kingdom's openness to new ideas, its willingness to recognize merit over birth. The reaction was explosive. Conservative nobles were outraged, calling it an abomination against tradition. Lord Min, his former father-in-law, stood and declared that the king was bringing shame upon the dynasty. Others echoed his sentiments, some more diplomatically than others, but the underlying message was clear: this was unacceptable. Quan listened to all the objections calmly. Then he spoke, and his words were measured but uncompromising. He reminded them that he was the king, that the throne gave him certain prerogatives, that he had considered this decision carefully and would not be swayed. He pointed out that the kingdom had survived many changes throughout its history, that clinging rigidly to the past was a path to stagnation rather than strength. More importantly, he tied his decision to the broader question of slavery. He announced that his commission had completed its review and would be recommending the abolition of slavery throughout the kingdom. He explained that this was not merely about Adia, but about recognizing the fundamental humanity of all people, regardless of their origins or circumstances. He argued that a kingdom that traded in human lives could never truly be great, that justice demanded change, that the gods themselves would judge them by how they treated the most vulnerable among them. It was a bold gambit, linking his personal desire to a moral cause that some in the kingdom had already begun to embrace. The reformist nobles, the younger generation, the scholars who had been debating these questions, they found their voices. Debates that had been confined to academic circles suddenly exploded into open political conflict. The kingdom spent the next months in turmoil. There were protests in the streets, both for and against the proposed changes. Some noble families threatened to withdraw their support from the throne. Others rallied to Quan's position, seeing an opportunity to reshape the kingdom's identity. The military remained loyal, which was crucial, but even among the soldiers, opinions were divided. Lady Xiaoyun, confronted with the reality of her husband's intentions, had to make her own choice. She could fight against the second marriage, could try to rally opposition, could make herself a symbol of traditional values under assault. Or she could accept what she could not change and try to maintain her position and protect her son's inheritance. She chose pragmatism over pride. In a private meeting with Quan, she negotiated the terms of the arrangement. Her sons would remain the heirs to the throne. This was non-negotiable. She would retain her status as first queen and maintain her political influence. In exchange, she would publicly accept Adia's elevation, lending it the legitimacy of her approval. It was a cold transaction, devoid of warmth or reconciliation. But it was also a recognition of reality. Quan would pursue his course regardless of her opposition. Better to adapt and maintain what power she could than to fight and lose everything. 6 months after Adia's return, the kingdom's laws were formally changed. Slavery was abolished. All those held in bondage were declared free. Compensation was provided to those who had owned slaves, funded by new taxes on luxury goods and foreign trade. The transition was not smooth. There were economic disruptions, social tensions, and pockets of resistance. But the power of royal decree, backed by military force and reformist enthusiasm, carried the day. And in the midst of this transformation, Quan married Adia in a ceremony that was both traditional and revolutionary. She wore the robes of a queen, embroidered with the symbols of Scylla's power. She spoke the vows in Korean, the language she had mastered through years of desperate study. She stood beside the king before the assembled court and received the crown that marked her as his equal in rank if not in authority. Many of the nobles attended with expressions of barely concealed disgust. Some refused to come at all. But others were there with genuine celebration, seeing in this moment the birth of a new era. The common people, many of whom had been slaves or related to slaves, saw her elevation as a sign that change was truly possible, that the rigid hierarchies that had defined their world might be less eternal than they had believed. Adia herself moved through the ceremony in a state of near disbelief. From a goatherder's daughter in Africa to a slave in chains to a queen of Silla, the journey was so improbable that it seemed like a story someone else had written. But when she looked at Quan, standing beside her with love and determination in his eyes, she knew it was real. Impossible, yes, but real. The years that followed were not easy. Quan's reign was marked by constant struggle between conservative and reformist forces. The abolition of slavery created economic disruptions that took years to resolve. Some noble families never forgave what they saw as the king's betrayal of tradition. There were attempted rebellions, which Quan suppressed with the same iron while his father had possessed. But there were also victories. The kingdom's economy adapted and eventually grew stronger without slavery. New trade relationships developed as Silla gained a reputation for justice that attracted merchants and scholars from distant lands. The arts flourished under Adia's patronage, as she used her position to support creative expressions that challenged old assumptions. The military remained loyal, and external threats were successfully repelled. Most importantly, the changes endured. What Quan and Adia had started together could not be easily undone. The next generation grew up in a kingdom where slavery was a thing of the past, where the queen was a foreign-born woman who had once been enslaved, where love had proved stronger than law. The stories of their struggle became legends, passed down through the years, inspiring those who faced their own impossible battles against injustice. Quan and Adia lived into old age together, surrounded by the children they had conceived and the kingdom they had transformed. They never forgot the garden where they had first spoken, the years of separation that had tested them, the moment when everything had seemed lost, but had somehow, impossibly, been recovered. On the day before Quan died, 43 years after he had first become king, surpassing even his father's reign, he called Adia to his bedside. His body was failing, but his mind remained sharp, and his love had never wavered. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked her, his voice weak but clear. "Everything you endured. Everything we fought for. The price we paid." She took his hand, her own fingers also marked by age now, but her grip still strong. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my humanity when everyone else had taken it away. You loved me when love seemed impossible. You changed a kingdom because you believed in justice more than tradition. How could I regret being part of that?" "We were young and foolish," he said, but he was smiling. "We should not have succeeded. Everything was against us. And yet here we are," she replied. "Old and gray, surrounded by children and grandchildren, in a kingdom that is better than the one we found. We won, my love. Against all odds, we won." He closed his eyes, and his smile deepened. "Yes, we did. And I would do it all again, exactly the same, just to have you beside me." "As would I," she whispered, leaning close. "As would I." He died the next morning, peacefully, with her hand in his. The kingdom mourned a great king, one who had transformed Scylla from a rigid, tradition-bound state into something more flexible, more just, more human. But Adia mourned the man, the prince who had seen a slave girl in a garden and recognized her humanity, who had waited 8 years to bring her home, who had risked everything for love. She lived another decade after his death, serving as advisor to their grandson who eventually took the throne. She wrote the story of their love, of a crown prince and a slave girl who had defied every barrier between them so that future generations would know the truth. She established schools where all children, regardless of their origins, could learn. She used her remaining years to continue the work they had started together. And when she finally died, surrounded by family in the palace that had once been her prison, she died free. Free from chains, free from bondage, free from the belief that her life could be owned by anyone. She died as a queen, as a reformer, as a symbol of the impossible made real. They buried her beside Quan, which itself was unprecedented, a foreign-born queen laid to rest in the royal tombs. But by then, enough had changed that the decision, while noted, was not contested. Her tomb was inscribed with a phrase in both Korean and the language of her homeland, words that captured the essence of her life. "Here lies Adia, the gift, who was stolen but not broken, enslaved but not defeated, loved and therefore free." The story of Quan and Adia became one of the most beloved legends of Silla, told and retold through generations. It was a story of love that transcended boundaries, of courage that defied tradition, of two people who believed that the world could be better and had the will to make it so. It was a story that reminded people that change, no matter how impossible it seems, begins with someone brave enough to love beyond what law allows. And in the gardens of the palace, where they had first spoken in moonlight, where he had freed her from her collar, where they had stolen moments of happiness during years of struggle, flowers continued to bloom each spring. They bloomed as a reminder that beauty can emerge from darkness, that hope can survive any winter, that love, true love, fierce and uncompromising love, is powerful enough to reshape kingdoms and redeem souls. The story lives on, carried forward by those who believe that every love contains the possibility of transformation, that every act of courage against injustice echoes through time, that the world belongs not to those who accept things as they are, but to those who have the audacity to imagine things as they could be and the strength to make that imagination real.